thousands of years, there have been many scribes and poets and all sorts of writers and thinkers and philosophers delving into what the ego is and what the ego is about. What is the ego for? How do we understand what the ego is? Knowing what the ego is and how it works and how it can work for us can absolutely help you on your spiritual journey. So let's go into it right now. You see, this life that we live is a life of duality. That is what's going on in this 3D matrix. We are having a duality experience. To get more understanding on duality, watch some of the other videos on the channel. You see, the ego is the duality that accompanies the soul. And so we can know what our soul is by understanding the ego and knowing that the soul is everything the ego is not. The ego is always worried about the future and all those sorts of things. It's always trying to solve problems, but the soul is not interested in that part. You see, the soul is not trying to solve problems. The soul is the pure witness. The ego is neurotic in that it's always concerned about what's going to happen next, whereas the soul is very present. Being present is all that matters to the soul, whereas for the ego, being present is impossible. And as we know, the ego is full of thought, and this helps us to understand that when the ego teaches us that our soul is everything the ego is not, we realize that we are not our thoughts. We realize we are not our actions. We are not even our bodies. We are the pure witness. Number two thing to be aware of when it comes to the ego is that it is simply a fact checker. It's always coming in and checking the facts. Now, facts are great, but facts are not life. We even talk about the facts of life, but you see that they are the facts of life. They are not the facts that are life. A fact is just a statement of what is, and we don't need to argue the facts. But what really is the experience of what is, which is the living. The living of our lives is the experience of the life we live. You see, when you're truly present to life, when you're truly living, you're not concerned about the facts. You are more available to just what is happening. You're not concerned about how a sun rises over the horizon. You are simply with the sun and the beautiful moment that is occurring. You are so present to it that you're allowing yourself to just simply be with it. So when someone says something, the ego is always going to be checking off whether it feels that that is a fact. And if it's not a fact and you have a very strong ego, it's going to want to argue the facts. It's going to want to go into some kind of debate. And that's the thing, is that the ego always has to be right. It's most important for it to be right. And so sometimes the ego will create drama so that there can be a battle going down to give the ego a chance to be right. And so the ego is also very much a saboteur of what it is you want for your life. The ego will come in and challenge yourself and others, instead of simply letting life be and letting others be who they are. The hardest thing for the ego to do is to allow another human being to be who they are. Think about that again. I want that to sink in. This is so important to understand. You know you're in your ego when you're not allowing people to simply be who they are, to simply be their presence and live their life without criticism, without someone judging them. The ego is against anyone doing anything that it doesn't agree with. Another thing that's really interesting about the ego is that it's life negative. You see, it's always fearing death, and death is obviously a negative. And because it's always fearing death, that's where the neurosis of the ego comes in, because it's always trying to avoid death, because the ego sees death as an absolute threat to its being. And it is to the ego, but not the soul. The soul cannot die, so having fear of death for the soul is absurd. The soul is always incarnating and reincarnating and is having all sorts of experiences beyond what we could possibly fathom. You see, the soul is that which is beyond the ego, beyond time, beyond space, beyond matter, beyond anything, because the soul is eternal. But by the ego fearing death, it stops you from living your life fully right now. because you're always trying to avoid a threat. The ego's always looking for a threat and always vigilant about something possibly going wrong. And that's what makes it become life negative. It's always looking for the wrong, not the right. Whereas for the soul, it simply allows what is to be and to witness and to learn. And because the ego is always trying to preserve life, it is then distracted from life. And so life is not truly lived to its fullest. You know that when you're not feeling like you're living up to your full potential, that life is not fulfilling for you, that is a sure sign that the ego is having too much of a say in your life. You're too identified with the ego and not identified enough with the soul. Another piece you want to understand about the ego is that it is a judge. That's all it does all day long. It's always judging. Now the problem is when you judge, you set yourself up to be judged. You see, under the laws of karma, if you judge someone, you will be judged back with that same measure. Christ even talked about that. With the measure that you give, so will that measure be given back to you. Because for the ego, judgment comes in and then the finger is pointed and out goes the blame, and then blame comes back because it's directed at another ego, and those egos go to war. You see, the powers that be in this world want to keep us in our egos, because as long as we're in our ego, we can't be at peace. When you are one with your soul and you realize that the ego is simply that which gives a background to your soul, you allow your soul to be in the foreground and your ego to be in the background, it just gives simply the context to knowing what your soul is, because it's not the ego back here. The life that we live at the moment, for most of us, the ego is in the front, all concerned about security and safety and stability. But the soul does not need these things because it is stable, it is secure, it is safe, and that's because the soul is eternal. Now remember, the ego doesn't want you to fully succeed because then it won't have problems to solve. So you don't want to be driven by the ego, because ultimately you will lose. It's interesting to understand that the ego is in fact time. You see, the ego is synonymous with time because the ego is synonymous with the mind, and mind is synonymous with time. And so the ego is made of time. It cannot understand the present moment. The present moment can't be known by the ego. It cannot just be present. The soul is always present because the present is eternity. Eternity is always now. Eternity cannot be later, and eternity cannot be yesterday. Eternity is the infinite now, and the infinite now is the essence of the soul, because the soul is eternal. But as for the ego cannot land in this moment. The ego is always in the past and always in the future. And so the ego is literally made of time. It is made of information, and it is made of time. But you see, information is not life itself, nor is time itself. They are the mediums in which we have the experience of this manifest life, this 3D reality. And finally, the ego does not exist. It's not real. It is simply data. It is information. It is not made of life. It's just an idea. And when you pass over or you drop the body, all of that ego goes away. The soul always remains, and the soul is the essence of your experiencing through all of the ages, through all of the lifetimes. Your soul is the truth of what you are. But the ego is simply what is experienced in this lifetime. It is not the experiencer itself. The ego is so concerned with preserving life, it's not possible for the ego to be actually enjoying the life, being present to the life. So think of the ego like a protection. Don't think of it as an enemy, but you're not living your life as a bodyguard to yourself. The ego is like a bodyguard, and let it be as such. You would not allow a personal bodyguard to come in and live your life. So why would we let the ego do that? It is there to protect us and look after us only, but it does not run the show, because it is not you. It is an assistance to your life. Your life is to be lived now and in the moment. So there's a few things for you to think about and ponder upon when it comes to the ego. Spend time in understanding your ego. When you know that you are not the ego, you can then live your life more freely, knowing that the ego is there to protect you in that, but it is not the one that lives the life itself. Placing the ego in a balanced place in your life will keep your spiritual path straight and true. Let there be light.